Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm your host, Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. You can reach me with comments and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or on Twitter at STS_news. I would love to hear from you. Student debt. I've been thinking about it a lot recently. I mean, it's hard not to, as it's been in the news nearly constantly lately, especially after the Biden administration announced its student loan forgiveness program. But even more, I've been thinking about it as I've begun working on the book project I call A Good History of Shit Jobs, in which I examine the U.S. economy since the 1970s and explore how it is that our economy has become so full of low-paying, dead-end crap jobs. The more I've looked into this history, the more I became interested in an important question. How did elected officials, especially Democrats, become so obsessed with college education as the answer to important social problems? As Christina Viviana Groger points out in her book, The Education Trap, the focus on education as a solution to inequality goes right back to the beginning of the 20th century, if not before. But what about this focus on college education? It's a focus you really see intensified amongst Democrats in the 1990s and in this century. It's a line of thinking that runs through figures like Robert Reich, and then President Clinton and Vice President Gore, and eventually Senator and President Obama, who was constantly holding up colleges as an answer to inequality. But this emphasis betrayed the truth on the ground. By 2005 or so, wages for college graduates began to stagnate and decline. Colleges were turning out increasing numbers of college graduates, but the economy wasn't producing increasing numbers of good jobs. So what happens when supply outpaces demand? And meanwhile, individuals were getting loaded up with massive amounts of debt. The federal student loan portfolio currently totals more than $1.6 trillion, owed by about 43 million borrowers. And as Tressie McMillan Cotton has shown in her book, Lower Ed, The Troubling Rise of For-Profit Colleges in the New Economy, this debt has unequally affected Black people and other minorities, the poor, and the already disadvantaged. But on a deeper level, we need to ask, where did our student loan system itself come from? How did we end up with this world where the way to deal with secondary and post-secondary education was to load individuals up with debt? Now, isn't it wonderful when you can ask a question like that and someone's got an answer for you? In this episode, I interview Elizabeth Tandy Shermer, an associate professor of history at Loyola University Chicago, known to her friends as Ellie, about her recent book, Indentured Students: How Government-Guaranteed Loans Left a Generation Drowning in College Debt. Shermer's story, like any good historian's, goes back to the 19th century. She reminds or teaches us that college education was always expensive for families, and that the tension between debt and charity in paying for college goes at least back to the 1920s. She shows us how the federal loan system emerged in the 1960s, but also how it arose from earlier developments such as the GI Bill. She also points out that the system often failed women and racial and ethnic minorities. And in the end, she shows us how our world of individuals drowning in college debt arose from a long series of decisions that prioritize private profit and risk over public benefit. I hope you enjoy this chat with Ellie. I truly had a lot of fun with her. Get excited! Ellie, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Absolutely. And just so your audience knows, in terms of radical honesty, we've known each other for years, which is why you know my real name as opposed to my crazy long Southern name that I was born with and published underneath, Elizabeth Tandy Shermer. And in fact, you are recording this from the state I was raised in, although I was raised in the northern part of Virginia and you were living in the southern part of Virginia.
Did you go to undergrad in California, or
no,
what was your undergrad institution?
University of Virginia.
All right.
Yeah,
I
one of those people. Yeah, it's okay.
And then you went out to California.
It's true. It's true. Well, my advisor in California was Nelson Lichtenstein, who had been at UVA, and we did not actually overlap, but his grad students were still there, and they were like, if you're interested in this stuff, capitalism, labor person you got to go work with is this Nelson Lichtenstein guy. And it turned out Santa Barbara was a great place to be interested in capitalism and policy. So that's how I ended up there.
That's interesting. I didn't know that story.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. If you find yourself talking to people about indentured students, what do you say it's about, and what were you trying to do with the book?
Oh my gosh. I tell them. Oh, actually, my joke I always say is that, spoiler alert, it doesn't end well for 45 million of us. and indeed, I actually dedicated the book to the 45 million of us drowning in debt. And the reason I wanted to do it, and if you don't mind, I'll tell you actually a little bit the story about how I actually got to the project.
That was my next question. So go for it.
How I got there was you and I are both in the history of capitalism circles, and I had written this book on the Sun Belt. And one of the things that I discovered that was so important for convincing big businesses like Motorola and GE to move into these little tiny towns like Atlanta and Phoenix was they needed the education infrastructure. And so even though a lot of people tell this story about public universities being recently privatized, being more recently dependent on private money, actually, it was a lot of private money that built places like Arizona State University. In ASU's case, this really tiny little teacher's college got a big engineering department dumped on them with a lot of GE and Motorola money. As a matter of fact, GE actually was taking over half of the office space for the electrical engineering program. Yeah. And so what I was working on is a project I'm actually back to now, which was called The Business of Education, that was trying to blow up this idea that we'd ever had this public and private academic system, that it was always like so much of American social welfare commingled. It's a big project. It goes to many different campuses to show that. It goes from the founding to the present. And then my father got sick, and my life changed. And I was cleaning out his house because he needed to be moved into a facility. And I found my student loan records that I had signed when I was 17 years old. And I realized that we didn't know anything about this industry. We didn't know anything about these guaranteed loan programs. No one mentions when they celebrate the 1965 Higher Education Act that is when the first real loan program started. And indeed, those people during the moratorium who've often still having to pay money on their federal loans, those are those original guaranteed loans. And so I sat there and I'm trying to figure out, how am I going to keep my job? How am I going to move forward? How am I going to care for my father? And this seemed like a more manageable project. It's a totally different research base. It's really a story of political intransigence and the intentional consequences that rather than fund higher education to keep costs down for ordinary people, to provide the research and technology that the public needs, the many uses of the university, that instead they were going to create on purpose a student loan industry. And they looked to the federal mortgage program of the 30s to do that, to create in the 30s, the guarantee on the federal mortgage program is the guarantee that bankers will be repaid. The guarantee on the student loans is that originally the bankers who made those loans would be repaid by the federal government. And the intention was to create an industry where there was not one. So that's how I came here.
It's a fascinating story. Yeah.
It's a little depressing. I got to say, when I first started working on it, I would check, because it never worked well for the American people. I would check my balance all the time.
Yes. Are you heading towards forgiveness? Where are you at with your loans?
So
can we talk about that?
We can totally talk about that. As a matter of fact, I prefer cancellation because none of us did anything wrong that we need to be forgiven for to go to college at all. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the whole point is, why does the federal government start playing around with these tuition assistance programs? They need young people to go to college, both to keep them out of competition for jobs, but also to get the training for later. It was always a part of the calculus. And in my case, it's true. I work at a private nonprofit university, but I still qualify for public sector loan forgiveness, the PSLF program. But there are a lot of people who are working, for example, in the medical industry. If they're not working for a nonprofit hospital, their employer technically doesn't qualify, even though all of us recognize that as essential work. And for me, I think the pandemic has really shown how much essential work there is that should be worthy of these PSLF programs. But to answer your question, I filed the paperwork in the beginning of this month to show that I have made all of those qualified payments. I've been told I'm due a reimbursement for all that I paid, and I haven't seen it yet. So we shall see.
Well, good luck. I'm about to start the process myself, but one of my good friends has been going through it for months now, and it itself can be a real headache. So good luck with that.
Oh, they lost my first 2 months, or my first 2 years of payments, but they have never met anyone who keeps as detailed a spreadsheet and records as I do.
I wish that was true of me too. I can believe it of you. I can believe it. So when I think, when most people talk about student loan debt, they're mostly focusing on the period from the 90s to the present. And some people talk about the earlier period of the 60s and 70s. But you start, like any good historian, of like pushing us back even further, going to very much the 19th century, but even looking at moments of like the founding. So, how does looking back at the roots of American higher education help us understand the history that you want to tell?
For me, it was really important to go back to the beginning to get rid of this idea that there had ever been a moment in this country's past where we had actually devoted the money for what became this very basic need. And I would also argue that the agricultural colleges from the Land Grant Act, agriculture and mechanical colleges from them, were also supposed to be about national need for an industrializing nation. Right. And yet, if you look very closely at the Land Grant app, and here I'm going to tell your readers to go take a look, or listeners, to go take a look at the Land Grab Universities project, which does the digital mapping to show exactly where the land was seized for a lot of those endowments, but it's just endowments. There's no guarantee that those state legislators were actually going to fund those institutions to actually keep them open, let alone to expand to meet ever increasing demand in the Gilded Age and the Progressive era. And I think the other thing to me that was really important is to see that we've had these lending programs that were campus-based. And the reason the earliest ones are from campus, we imported that tradition from Europe. But the reason is because this is a terrible financial product. I'm going to give you a loan for something that I cannot repossess. And even if I could take one of your many degrees, Lee, and sell it to someone else, that would rob you of the credentials that you need to compete for the well-paying work to pay me back. It's just an absolute nightmare. So is there any wonder that you didn't actually have an industry until the federal government came in with a guarantee on a financial product that banks really didn't want to touch?
Yep. It really is fascinating. I mean, I won't stretch out this analogy for too long, but there's something to be said for like the role the federal government played in like the nuclear industry, that there's some things like industry just doesn't want to touch without the federal government coming in and saying, no, we'll make it safe for you, basically, and then they're like, all right, well, we'll come in then. It's fascinating. And
to me, like that, what's really important about that is something I did it in one of my essays for Reviews in American History, is that there's a tendency that historians and social scientists have wanted to say that the financialization of the economy is really like a post-70s thing. But man, the federal government has been dabbling in a lot of tricky financing forever, and so I think what I'm hoping, besides, I do want to show the public the origins of of the student loan industry that touches so many lives in this country, but also to get us all thinking about that when we talk about, for example, eras like the New Deal, the 1930s, and we talk about the white working class getting a New Deal, actually, they got a lot of creative financing. They got a lot of creative financing with a federal guarantee for bankers to finance a white middle class lifestyle at home. And we got to sit with that and think about that as one of those continuities in history.
I like that. I also just like, there was a lot of, I've looked at the history of higher ed often for various reasons, including because I teach it sometimes, but I thought you were drawing new things out of different decades. So I didn't really think about how important the 20s were for higher ed, because, there's affluence, there's money, a lot of more people are starting to go to school. But right away, you get this tension between debt and like charity or handouts. Absolutely. Or however we're going to talk about this, right? And so you had some beautiful stuff about Herbert Hoover, who I love dearly, pushing loans, and so how does this, this seems like a very American tension that always plays out, but tell us a bit about this, debt versus charity thing.
Oh, absolutely. And especially since, some of a lot of what we have in the federal programs is all modeled off of things that campuses were doing. So they used to call these what we would now call financial aid, but it's really tuition assistance, right? Is they would actually call it the charity funds for those poor but talented students. And that's always been a tension. Do we want to help the poor students, or do we reserve that money for the talented students? And there's also been a really important idea that this education can't be free, that would be somehow un-American of it. And I think when you see that with Hoover, when he's like, they have all those fancy cars. And if you think about him making this argument in the 1920s, when you can buy things on credit, and it's becoming more, and he's like, they can pay, sort of later. And even I think, because actually a dear friend of mine, he's a historian too, said, he's like, Ellie, do you realize that you have just skewered one of the most beloved pieces of legislation in American history, the GI Bill? But the very idea that they had already done the labor to earn this education, right, through the GI Bill. But then some of the leading liberals in Congress at the time, including Claude Pepper, are saying, we got to keep these subsistence payments low. We don't want these people just drifting and just hanging out in college. And I was like, later, that generation would be known as the greatest generation. But at the time, there is this sense that we don't want them loafing in college on the taxpayers' dollars, from some of our leading liberals at that moment in time. And I think it really just gives us a sense about this idea that Americans are expected to work for their basic rights.
You also show, I loved the New Deal chapter was great, I thought. And the work on, we think of work study as this, this education thing, but something that came out in your account is that it was as much about the job market sucking and attempts to deal with like that as it was about, as a kind of education act. So, tell us a bit about the history of work study and how they thought of it at that time.
Oh, thanks. Again, this is one of those things that they actually pulling from a campus experiment. So we had campuses offering these sort of ideas that you can work part-time so that you can afford to study. And that's the reason New Dealers are like, we're not going to bail out these college universities, right? But what we'll do is we'll have this work study program. And the main calculus is we want to get these young people out of competition for jobs. We do not want them competing with those from the ages of 25 and, if you think about it, 65, because work study is the same year as they pass Social Security, right? We want to have, we don't want them in that main component. The other part of it is like, there is conversations amongst the New Dealers, and which would continue as we get closer and closer to World War II. The nation's labor pool is not adequate, particularly as they're thinking about what it will take to prepare for war. We need a better trained labor pool. So as much as people like to wring their hands right now as about how education is about a job, it doesn't change the fact that really what's going on here is that it has always been that way from the point of view of the federal government. And just to jump a little bit forward, to the 1960s, one of the reasons that the Johnson administration is so keen to have higher education is that that seems like an easier way to eventually get to addressing civil rights, long-term racial inequities. They don't quite have gender inequities on their mind in the Johnson administration. Is that we're not going to try and force employers to pay people equally, even though that should be doing it on the law. But what we'll do is we'll make sure that we can have that equal opportunity to go to college, and that should make up for the historic disparities in what people are paying. So as opposed to so many academics who are so upset is like, when did college become about a job? Y'all, from a lot of people's perspective, it always has been.
Yeah.
But that being said, can I say one thing though, in terms of, I will say one thing about it is that, but a lot of the folks who were excited to go to college, it's true, a lot of them had job concerns on their minds, including those GIs and including those in work study. But there's many examples of ordinary people with the chance to study, including in the work study program, including in the GI. They were just excited to finally have a chance to discover and enjoy the liberal arts, that they appreciated that this was supposed to be not just to help with the 8 hours for 8 hours that you work. It was supposed to help you better enjoy that 8 hours you were supposed to have for what you will. So it's the famous, since we're getting close to Labor Day, the famous 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what you will. A recognition about the importance of higher education for that as well.
No, it's well put. So another thing I loved about these earlier chapters is, you think like the federal government getting involved in higher education and like maybe bringing some money into the colleges and professors and administrators, they're gonna love this, right? But you repeatedly show that actually they're pretty worried. They're not sure they actually want the federal government around. So yeah, tell us about forms of pushback during this period, not just amongst conservatives, mind you, but like just pushback from all kinds of folks.
Well, it's that whole question of federal power, right? And in the minds of academics, it is that academic freedom. It is that institutional autonomy and the fear of what the federal government being dictates. So, the question about like, why was there not a big bailout for colleges and universities? And so the construction programs that some of your listeners might know about, those construction programs, that was only open to public college and universities because there was a concern of federal money, taxpayer money, federal money going to private institutions, even though they're a nonprofit. But also the college and universities, they had to apply for them and they were matching. And that's really important. There isn't actually the coercion. And the same with work study. There was no dictate that a college or university participate in work study. Now, it is true that if you don't offer it, there's a bunch of students who are going to apply to the place down, who does offer it. So there is that aspect of it. But there's still so much authority that how work study worked was, I'll tell you what, you give those students jobs and the federal government will pay them for it. But you get to decide within the general parameters about how much students were supposed to work and how much you're supposed to pay. But they got to set everything. The colleges and universities got to set up to it. So it was this fear of having all of this control. And it was just one of those things. It's just, to me, it's also one of those longstanding tendencies in American history that there is this concern about federal control, leaving aside the segregated schools, which are deeply afraid and cite the question of states' rights. And that is a historic thing with education. It was supposed to be left to local, state, and then private voluntary associations. And that's the fear with the federal government, which never really tried.
So you already, you kind of flagged this earlier, but the GI Bill is one of the most beloved acts of government in U.S. history, and so you had to go right and stab it in the heart for all of us.
Suzanne Mettler did it before me. I just want to point that out there. That Suzanne Mettler did it before me.
So what do you think standard accounts of the GI Bill miss or get wrong about the actual history as it happened?
Well, I think part of it is that they miss that it was just such a bitter fight on all aspects of it, and questions of keeping the South segregated, keeping the races unequal. Actually, of course, the fact that many women GIs were also excluded as well, that is just not a part of the story. And I think also there is this idea that, the celebration of so many veterans getting to go to college. Well, the actual number is 2.2 out of 11 million. That's actually what the number is. And that's not as big a percentage as you would think. It's still important. But I think the other aspect of it too is, and this is important, is that the memory of those veterans who had the opportunity to go to college, and I think this speaks to this importance about that, even though a lot of these federal policies, and the GI Bill also, it was intended to keep the veterans out of competition for jobs. There's real fear when they're designing this program that you would have another economic downturn like after World War I. And the fear is veterans selling apples on the street corner. They invoke that image. That's exactly a part of it, but it doesn't change the fact that so many veterans really, really value this opportunity, and those memories of not getting their subsistence checks on time, those memories of the absolutely terrible living conditions, because what actually happened again with the GI Bill, no federal appointee is forcing a college or university to take veterans to participate in the GI Bill. But all of a sudden you have this guarantee of tuition revenue. You sure as heck is going to take that. And then, but they're greatly accepting far more many veterans and also keeping up with the civilians as well. And the campuses just cannot accommodate that. So, I mean, the image I think of the GI Bill has to be actually of overcrowded classrooms and really terrible living conditions, like military surplus, which I think makes the 2.2 million veterans who were able to take advantage of it, I think it makes all the more impressive. It really, really does.
Yeah, and another thing that I thought you did a great job pointing out is that because of the way the rates were set in the GI Bill, that a lot of universities took the opportunity to jack up their tuition and other fees. So it actually made it like less accessible to other folks who, didn't get the stipend.
And I think the sad part about that is like, it's this question of design, is that there was not going to be federal money, and they could not guarantee that states would provide the money to expand the universities to not only meet the needs of GIs, but the prediction that many more Americans, that the country needed many more people to get a college education, that was not going to happen. And so the idea is we'll do it through the tuition revenue. Right. And I think it's one of those, this is a great example of the unintended consequences, not being able to consider just how much tuition would increase, because tuition increased a lot during the GI Bill. And it's also, sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, a remarkable percentage in the 1950s, to the point where recently elected JFK is warning Congress. I believe the percentage is actually 90%, but he makes this very dramatic point that if the average cost of college is about $7,000 a year at the time, and that is more than half of what what most families take home. And this is in a moment where families are likely to be larger than they are today, that most American families cannot afford to send their kids. And I think that's so helpful, because when you just look back at the numbers about what tuition costs were, which leans out you're not thinking about the money you're not making while you're not working, it's really hard for people to wrap their heads around. But if most Americans are making less than $15,000 a year, families, it puts that all into perspective.
I felt like at some points in the book, you really got into like full on debunker mode, which of course warms my heart because I go that route too. But this chapter titled "The Fizzled Response to Sputnik," and it definitely is a kind of standard narrative in U.S. higher ed history that, like, all right, the Soviets put up Sputnik, and the U.S. responded by ramping up higher ed, and and it was beautiful, and we got a bunch of engineers and scientists out of it. So tell listeners how the response to Sputnik actually fizzled.
Congress spent almost a year fighting over it. That's what they did. And I do think that another thing I hope people take away, I am so friggin' tired, someone who grew up in the DC area, of everyone saying partisanship and congressional stalemates started in the 90s. No, it did not. The only time where we actually had landmark legislation sailing through Congress, 30s and the 60s, when one party controlled all three branches of government and had supermajorities in Congress. That's how that actually happened, you guys. That's what happened.
Yeah.
And it just drives me crazy. And it's true, the parties are resorting themselves, so it's not as easy to see. But so yes, they spent almost a year fighting. And what they ended up with was a temporary bill. It was just a temporary bill. And the one that I hate is at the very last minute, they changed an undergraduate scholarship program, which would not have been enough to cover the full cost of tuition at the time, at any, with the exception of a few that were tuition free, like the University of California at the time, would not have been enough to cover that. They changed that to a loan program. And I always think about that as really opening up this Pandora's box. But I think my favorite part about that chapter is actually the end where I get into the rollout of it. And I was like, they're basically shoving banking duties onto it's then the Office of Education, which had until then just collected statistics because they didn't really have much input with the GI Bill or work study. And they're sitting on orange crates trying to figure out how to run a loan program and discovering pretty darn quick that what was supposed to be self-perpetuating, the idea is that the student would borrow. They would start having to pay back after graduation. They would pay back with their interest. Their interest would make the loan program grow so that it could grow to accommodate more students. It never worked, especially since one of the biggest fights that's actually always been happening in these tuition assistance programs is who deserves some, you want to call it forgiveness, fine, who deserves some kind of cancellation, the expectation that teachers would have it at the time. And it just, it didn't work. And it became pretty quick that this was not going to be self-perpetuating like they thought.
So in the mid-'60s, then, I mean, things start moving pretty quick in a lot of ways. The federal government really did start getting involved in loans in new ways, as you already kind of flagged earlier. So, when it comes to like the federally guaranteed part, tell us a bit. I mean, like, why did that come to be at that moment, and what did it look like initially?
Well, there's a couple of reasons why it's actually that perfect moment. People paying long-term for things, for example, like houses over time, had become more common, right? And the other thing too is that in the mid 60s, remember, Congress is basically, for the most part, white men, right? Whether poverty, that's what we're talking about. And these are the folks who could look at the then federal mortgage program and consider it an amazing success. In the 1930s, instead of going down the road of public housing like the United Kingdom did, what we did was instead we had this guaranteed mortgage. We created this mortgage industry where there really hadn't been one. I mean, there's some mortgage work done earlier, but that's what we're going to do. And I know, even though you and I know, and now your listeners know, you can repossess a house and sell it to someone else, but you can't do that with a student degree. That is what we'll use. They are literally using that as their model. And a part of that is in the context of the Great Society, which is, and the war on poverty, a lot of spending, a lot of programs. There's also a war on Vietnam. This seems like a cheaper way. And it might be cheaper for the federal government, although later it would actually be shown that this approach cost the federal government more because of how they did the bookkeeping than the direct loans in the 1990s. This seemed a cheaper way to get more people going to college. That's literally what the calculus was. And I think one of the most important parts about that, as I flagged it before, this is white men looking at a mortgage program that seemed a success. This is before we have the amazing work that has really shown how the mortgage program worsened racial and gender inequalities. Gender, of course, because women couldn't really own homes on their own, and not realizing that because those same inequities would be perpetuated by the student loan program. Even though the way that I talk about it is a lot of these experiments in the 60s, there's a lot of colorblind run going on there. So this idea that we're trying to do something for racial inequity.
Yeah.
Again, they don't really have women on their mind. It's in the early 70s, and it's because women put it there. We don't really, that's what we're going to do. But you know what? What we'll do is the loan program was for those white middle-income Americans who may not be able to do it. The revival of the work study program, again, one of those things caught by that political stalemate that's not supposed to exist yet in the 1930s, but we're going to revive the work study that's supposed to be for students of color, similar with the campus grants. But you know what? They leave the campuses in charge. It's the financial aid administrators who get to decide. Admissions decides who's invited. Financial aid officers decide who gets that money. And there has been a problem where for financial aid officers, tuition assistance has often been used as a set of time to buy brains and brawn. Athletes and smart students, build your alumni base, make sure you got the talent, to compete, to bring those ticket sales in. And it's you can see it from the get-go. And the key thing was, we're going to guarantee bankers repayment. And that's the thing, is like one of the things. I was very lucky enough to get to a session with the architect of the Australian loan program. And yeah, it's amazing. It's one of the most incredible nights of my life. This is also great too, Lee. That first time we met at the OEH and shared a van home, or van to the airport, excuse me, was and the Australian loan program is called the Higher Education Contribution. And the idea is you're contributing just to the education, as opposed to in the United States, the guaranteed student loan program, the guarantee was for the bankers. But you, and so many have, and still do, assume the guarantee was for students. There was no guarantee that students would get the loan that the financial aid officers had decided for them. And also there was no guarantee that those students would get the loans for the tuition revenue that schools have historically depended on.
I want to talk a bit more about inequities in a second. But before we get there, there's like the Higher Education Act gets reauthorized in 1972. It's
the most important one.
At the same time, and at the same time as Title IX, and which is much more famous in a sense. But why was that reauthorization so important in this history?
Sure, and Title IX, it's 1972, and it's funny because a lot of people don't realize it was a part of the reauthorization, and that's like one of those weird things about American lawmaking and policy. You're like, what is this? We just, the textbooks, it's just passed. Well, most of the post-New Deal legislation has to come up every couple of years for reauthorization. From some perspective, it's a way to kill the bill and trim it. Others from the idea, the expand upon it. It all depends. And you had to really understand this as a post New Deal phenomenon in terms of thinking about this, because that's why Social Security does not come up for reauthorization, which also means that's why Medicare and Medicaid don't, because those are just amendments to Social Security. And so there's a lot of this sort of reaction against just the broad changes made in the 1930s for have this reauthorization process. So 72 is reauthorization. And you have a lot of incredible push for what is Title IX. And I always tell people Title IX was always more about women in sports. And one of the big impetus for it from its supporters was the idea that if for some reason the Equal Rights Amendment did not pass, because 72, they think it's going to sail through, but just in case, we want this to guarantee this for this education that is, again, supposed to be that avenue for equal opportunities on the job market. And of course, we all know what actually happened is the ARA did not pass. Although your current state, my former home state, just recently ratified it. So watch this space to see what happens. And then the other thing that happens in 72 is Claiborne Pell pushes for the grants that are now named after him. And these are really important, the Pell Grants, because they come directly from the federal government. And it's a very complicated scheme based on how much your family earns. But the whole point was to get around those admissions officers, right? That's the whole, and the campuses and things like that you would have this basic kind of amount. But I always think that the most important things about it in the long run, I know Pell Grants are important, and we do understand that Title IX is important too. But it is the creation, one is making for-profit schools eligible for these civilian tuition assistance programs, because this starts to open up the doors to our now friends, the University of Phoenix. And indeed, you and I are talking when they've just had yet another Biden administration official has decided to forgive the debt taken out by one of these predatory for-profits in the online space. But this is a really critical moment. And the second is, of course, the creation of Sallie Mae, literally and openly modeled off of Fannie Mae, because there had bankers' participation in the student loan program had been laggard, even though they had been guaranteed a profit, they had been guaranteed repayment. But this was going to make it easier to buy and sell student debt. And the key aspect of this is how it can really help build an industry, is that if in your portfolio of these really terrible financial products, very risky, you have a chunk that are guaranteed repayment by the federal government, maybe you start offering others that don't have that guarantee, but that might even be more profitable. And it fits a new need from students and parents, because parents do not yet have the parent loan program. It's established in the 80s. And there's limits about how much students can borrow, right? And so, but it is not keeping pace with the soaring costs of tuition in the 70s, as there's less spending on higher education. Yeah. And there we go.
So it already seems pretty obvious in your 70s chapter and, thereabouts, that, as you kind of said earlier, that this is mostly benefiting white dudes and, and most, and when not white dudes, white women. But it's not helping the people who need help the most. And this is pretty apparent in the numbers. So were leaders simply not taking this into account? Was it not in the public yet that this was a problem? Or, what is the disconnect between the leadership and this reality?
Well, I think in some cases, one of the reasons it is that both the Nixon administration had a different kind of version of the Pell Grant that they were pushing, but both Pell and Nixon administration are interested in some kind of something approximating a basic grant. There is a recognition that, we're still having a lag in terms of people of color, and their minds are really focused on Black men at this time. It's the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
They don't see a much more, we now know, a much more broader American public, much more diverse American public. But they're not really just willing to talk about it openly, right? It is this entire colorblind language. But that's where I think it's really, really important that those who were able to go to college, those who became scholars of color, very important, not only they did that research and they continue to talk about it. And I think that has been so important in much of the conversation about student debt, including in the mainstream media, is about how unequally it is felt. And that is a tribute, not only the researchers who took up that mantle and did that work, but the activists who took it and harnessed it and had made it a part of conversation. And I would include that actually in some of our politicians who are pushing for really progressive stances, for example, college for all, for cancellation. Really, Ayanna Pressley is just like, look, this is about racial and gender inequities, and we're not going to pretend that it isn't. And that is a real credit to it, as opposed to all of these colorblind innuendos. One of my favorite, by the way, in the 65 Higher Education Act is they have this money set aside for developing institutions, which was a code word for what we now call historically Black college universities, a recognition that they were not going to be able to guarantee a year after the Civil Rights Act that there would be equal admissions at these college universities, especially since that was done by the courts. And my alma mater sure as hell did fight it. You can decide if you want to edit out the curse word, but that there was going to be a need to support these historically underfunded institutions, but they would not do it openly. So they called it developing institutions. And I think you can actually see how mainstream this awareness and protests to ingrained inequalities are, that we do have the Biden administration And even in some of the rescue packages during the pandemic's still going on. You and I know that, even though our institutions don't, they're going to set it aside for HBCUs, HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, and MSIs, minority serving institutions, that we're not going to pretend anymore. We're going to set this money aside. They're underfunded. They're helping an important population. And that's really a credit to the activists and also the researchers who they've really sort of taken that work from.
So in this period after the reauthorization, and then other changes that come later, it really launches, takes off in a whole new way. And on page 252, you say, government policies since the 1972 reauthorization has benefited the student loan industry, not the academy. Experts later emphasized that Sallie Mae had turned this sector into a, quote, gold mine. And at this point, there's something like 3,000 student lenders or something like that. But at the same time, I think your last substantive chapter is called Bankers Lose Their Sweetheart Deal. So how did bankers lose their sweetheart deal in this sector that also looks like a real gold mine for the finance sector?
Well, to be honest, it actually, and the real threat starts in the early 90s, is direct lending. And when we have the published reports, so one, the investigations showing the for-profits, and this is even before they really make a gold mine online, the investigations and realizing that how the Johnson administration had done the accounting for the Guaranteed Student Loan Program had hidden how expensive it was. The only thing showing up on the budget books was the covering of the interest while the student was in school, which does nothing about the accumulation of it. So there's studies shown that the federal government directly lending to students, and it does go through the college or university, right? That will actually be a lot cheaper, is what it will be. And all they're able to do is, in the very end of the first Bush administration, get a tester program. It's one of the things that Bill Clinton manages to do before the Republicans take Congress in the 95 election, so taking seats in 96. It's one of the things that they're able to do. But it's just a small program, right? And the bitter fights over it, because the student loan industry has a lot of lobbying power, is just a certain number of schools, limited how much, all this stuff. But it becomes really important to the Obama campaign. And this is something that, and I do understand our popular memory of the Obama campaign in 2008 is, of course, about Obamacare, about healthcare. But another thing that he brought to the campaign trail was that he and Michelle Obama had just recently paid off their student loans, and really making that a key part. And one of the goals before those midterm elections in 2010 was, we're going to not just get healthcare, but we're going to get the end of the Guaranteed Student Loan Program and making the direct student loan program the only thing coming from the federal government. And it is one heck of a fight for them to actually do it, but they managed to do it. And again, so critical to that was actually the activists and researchers who had doing a lot of this work along the time, including to counter the lobbying efforts to stop that. And I think for me is like the way that I think about this, what I think is so perfect, I hate to use that word, but perfect about when Obama signs the Budget Reconciliation Act, then enacts Obamacare, and ends the Guaranteed Student Loan Program, replaces it. It's the Healthcare and Education Reconciliation Act. They're two together. It calls it killing two birds, two victories in 1 week. It's really amazing, is the fact that if you go back to it in the 1930s, the two things that the New Dealers tried and failed to do was get healthcare and a higher education guaranteed. That was the hope, because work study was such a success. It was the hope that would be included in Social Security. And then some of the two biggest expenses that Americans have, healthcare and medical debt. And you can just see how deeply intertwined they are, the financial products that fund these two really important industries, meds and eds. Yeah.
So I feel like there's like a couple counterfactuals or alternatives hanging in the background of the story of like, we could have gone on other roads, I guess. And so, I mean, what do you think? I mean, this is also an opportunity to talk about what you would prefer to see in the world. But I mean, when you think about where the roads we could have gone down, is it direct investment in making college more affordable? Is that the vision you see?
Well, I think the thing is that we do actually have states who did do direct investment to make higher education more affordable. One of them is in California. That being said, I tell everyone, including scholars, like, you should actually read Clark Kerr's Uses of the University. This is our debunking, is that if you read it, Clark Kerr is very clear that a lot of private money is coming into his multiversities, because there's a lot of private money coming into the UC system to expand it, even though that legislator is putting a lot of money. But the idea was that master plan, that 3-tiered master plan, was going to be tuition free, but there was that investment. So at the state level, I also think it's really interesting to think about what would it have been like if they had been able, the dream was to make work study as permanent as Social Security was. That's really interesting as well. I think also one of those, I'm sorry, just getting chills thinking about it. What would it have meant? And this is a critical part of the GI Bill story that we didn't talk about. The members of the FDR administration, they desperately, desperately want the civilian agencies overseeing things like Social Security to do the GI Bill. Now, one of the practical reasons of this, there's a lot of benefits in the GI Bill, which they're, accustomed to actually doing.
Yeah.
But the political calculation was, if we can get it in a civilian agency, we can someday lift that barrier and make it open to all. And their conservatives in Congress are not fools. They are not fools, and that's why they fight so friggin' hard to put it under the VA and to make sure that the GI Bill is temporary. So this is a little known fact. We actually have multiple GI Bills. The most generous was the first one. And I think that that's another idea of a road not taken. What would it have meant if that idea had been made as permanent? And I think for me, though, what's hard is that, when you were talking in the book about this fear of federal control, is that it's not really in the American imagination to think about that federal investment in higher education. And even one of the most progressive ideas that we have, the College for All Act, which Jayapal and Sanders put in a lot, keep putting in, is that even that is having a tuition-free public option, which is what's happening in New Mexico and to a certain extent in New York State right now. So it's always looking to see what these folks are experimenting with. Even that is actually just reaching back to another New Deal innovation, the TVA, which was just to have a public competitor. We're going to try
the public option.
Yes, and deal. Same with Obamacare. We're just going to reach down. We're going to have this public competitor in the marketplace. So it is going back to that question that we were talking about, how part of this project is for me to try to show how much important finance and market ideas have been a part for a long time in American history, not a post-70s thing, that's what it is. And to be honest, with Build Back Better, the original flavor, which included, that was what was passed, 2 free years of community college. What I was really interested in see what was going to happen was if they could get tuition-free community college in there. It's interesting because it's also dealing with that marketplace. If you make those first 2-year frees, what does that do for the price at the private 4 years and the public 4 years? What does that do? And also, because of the way that they did it, it was very similar to the Obamacare, where the states would get to choose in terms of having this option. Would free community college, because we have it in states like Tennessee, right? Would that go over that hurdle that healthcare couldn't back in 2008? And I don't have a good answer for that, but I think it's one of those counterfactuals. I'm not 100% sure, because a lot of the student loan debt is actually held in red states.
The book came out in late 2021, is that right?
It came out in August of 2021.
Okay. And so, your epilogue deals with things like strike debt and what it was being written at the time about, like, the for-profit school problem coming back up in, like, public attention. and how that bears on race and other issues, which is really important. But I just wonder, like, where, if you had, like, we're gonna put out a new edition, you're gonna bring up the epilogue up to now. I mean, where are we now? I feel like the issue of education and student debt got a lot of attention in the early Biden days, but the way the Biden administration's kind of gone, I'm not sure that it's going to get another push at this point. So I don't know, where do you think things are at?
I hear you, but I think what's interesting is the only thing that remains of those pandemic things, which, like, thinking about back to the New Deal and the GI Bill, like what actually might survive the New Deal, it's just the moratorium. The only thing that has actually survived from those pandemic relief programs is the moratorium. Now, part of that is that, from what I am hearing from the student loan industry, because I have friends who used to work in it, is that some of the servicers doing PSLF, the servicer doing PSLF has just gotten out. Other servicers are also leaving as well. And this is, by the way, this is what happens when you end the direct loan program, the guaranteed student loan program. And the guaranteed student loan program, and those that are big enough end up servicing the debt for the federal government, and still hanging in there. You see them actually leaving, but the other thing too is the education department, which has a lot on its plate, and the Biden administration in general has too. They haven't done the work to prepare people to start paying again. The last time I talked to someone in the education department, because they read the book too, I was very honored that they read the book, and they talked to me about what ideas I had. So they let me know about the PSLF changes that were coming down the pike. Was they had plans to inform borrowers about, restarting and all this stuff, and we have not seen that. So I'm pretty sure, don't get me don't you can quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure we'll probably have another moratorium, that they haven't done the work. They haven't transferred my loan.
Interesting.
So but that's the only thing that remains. But I think it goes something that, even if it's true that we get that $10,000 in cancellation, it's going to be what the book shows. It's only for a few, but never enough.
Yeah.
And that's just the thing that runs through it. And I think that's what I would say. But I would also want to, again, lift up the people who kept this on the administration's agenda. And it has really been inspiring. People coming out, the thing is, what was so hard about this book, everyone has this idea that this debt is recent, but that's because everyone was sharing their pain privately to their lawmakers, to their elected representatives, which, as I like to point out throughout the book, the Nixon administration just called grief mail. So in the midst of 70s stagflation, that is what he thinks. People who can't afford to educate their children. Yes. Tweet.
Yeah, well, Twitter's good for some things, including aggregating grief. So,
yes, it is true.
I have thought. I've been following issues around. We might be heading into a recession. It's very uncertain at this point because the numbers are so wacky. And I've been looking with friends at, like, people taking on more debt. It looks like people are taking more credit card debt on and things as things tighten up a little bit in the economy. And, something I was thinking about while I was chatting with you is, so far we have not had a lot of the people not paying their credit card bills and stuff. That hasn't been a thing. People are paying their bills, all right? We're not seeing a lot of issues around that. Same with mortgages. We haven't seen a lot of people stop paying their mortgage. But, one issue I think is that we do have this moratorium going on. Yeah. And so people are not paying $2 to however many dollars a month, $200 to however many dollars a month on average. So that kicks back in. I don't know. It could be it's an ugly moment for that to come back online potentially.
Absolutely. And you're worried about people, like, buying too much. If you have an $800 student loan debt, and that's you're not. And then we can also talk about, like, what might be happening on the housing market, either for rentals or for home ownership, for sure. And I think especially too is that, what I think when we have the ideas about how many people are expressing that the reason they move back home, the reason that they're not buying houses, the reason is that they have this student loan debt. By the way, just to plug in, I'm still, like, coming off the emotional roller coaster that was Emily the Criminal, who was, do you know about this new movie?
No.
Oh, Emily the Criminal. And one of the reasons she turns to crime is because she has a $70,000 student loan and she can't keep up with the interest payments. So, and it's, I thought when people were telling me to go to what I thought about it, I initially thought it was like, what is it, like a throwaway line? Because you'll get those like throwaway lines in literature and stuff like that.
Yeah.
No. This is a full blown, they are talking about her entire journey about why she has all this debt and wasn't able to actually finish her degree. And part of it was that she had to drop out of school, take care of a family. So, yeah, it's a much more complicated space.
So, are you returning to the business of higher education? Is that what's next for you?
Yes, I will
you?
finish that book. I'm going to finish the business of education book, and it's the campus story, and it looks at how we get to the sort of state systems of higher education with these flagship institutions on it. And again, spoiler, they all have these incredible public-private origins, and there's always been a lot of business investment because they never got the funding that they needed, including the UC campus that I'm working on, in order to actually make it tuition free and to just depend on it. So the whole idea, and I'm hoping it gives us a different geography, understanding that we've had many uses of the university long before Clark Kerr laid them out for the post-industrial world, but actually that it has been a part of it, that these institutions have been built into the very fabric, of American life.
I think it sounds like a lot of fun, and it's going to do a lot of debunking in the classic Shermer style that I appreciate so much.
I appreciate. Well, actually, the one I was going to tell you is I don't know if I ever told you my favorite debunking thing, because the Sunbelt book did it too. And one was I know you guys are really focused on these Southern Democrats becoming Republicans, but did you ever notice that there's a lot of Western Democrats who become Republicans? Goldwater family and stuff like that. But my favorite one is one of our mutual friend Shane Hamilton. He's like, Ellie, you should just do a separate story about that. There's this little section in the Sunbelt book, which was the Sunbelt wasn't air conditioned. Just so you know, the factories that they built for the light electronics were. The wealthy people, like the Goldwater family, they had air conditioning. The rest of it, not so much, until the 90s. I mean, my grandparents didn't have air conditioning either. So yeah, I actually did the census count on the air conditioning.
Nice.
Yes.
Nice.
I try.
Well, Ellie, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today. This is a lot of fun.
Absolutely. It was fun. It was a good reunion. We haven't seen each other in a while.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. Peoples and things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. Check out her work at julianacastro.co. Peoples and Things is a production of Virginia Tech Publishing and is supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. Production activities are hosted in the Athenaeum, a space in the library that acts as a hub for digital humanities teaching, learning, and creation. Joe Fort is the media production manager with Virginia Tech Publishing and serves as producer and sound engineer for Peoples and Things. Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. I also want to thank you for listening. Thanks.